Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today on Classic Mini DIY. Today we are going to be doing a heater delete on your Classic Mini. Sometimes people want to free up a little bit of space in their cabin, or they're turning their car into a race car, don't really need a heater. This job is for those people. It's a pretty easy job, but it can be a little messy, so you're going to want to make sure you have gloves, and you're going to want to make sure that you're working on the car while it's cold. You don't want to do this job right after you've been driving the car because the coolant is going to be really hot. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to want to do is disconnect the heater on the engine side. Now, Minis are set up a lot of different ways, but the main two spots that are going to be the same on any Mini is this top outlet here. This comes off the top of your head, and coolant comes up through this, runs through this line right here, down into the cabin and into the heater core. Once it passes through that heater core, it comes back out this hose right here and runs directly into the recycle or the return for your coolant. Now this is a really simple coolant loop here. Some cars have a little bit more complex loop. The coolant comes out here, runs into the car, runs into the heater, passes through the heater, comes back out here, or on this other side. It can be different because you'll see the master cylinders are on this side because this is a right-hand drive car, but left-hand drive cars will have the master cylinders over here, so the coolant will run in one of the two sides. When it comes back out, it sometimes runs into your intake manifold. There's two tubes that sit on the ends of your intake manifold, and the purpose of that is the coolant actually warms the intake manifold a bit, which helps aid the car in the winter, so you don't get a cold vortex and you don't freeze up your carburetors. So what we're going to want to do, if your car does have that coolant loop in the intake manifold, we're going to want to retain that. So if your car has that more complex coolant loop, you're going to run the coolant from here out of the output into the intake here. It'll come out this side and it'll go into the return there. Once we finish that up, your coolant will be a closed loop right there. And if you're like my car with no intake manifold warming, it'll just run from here into the recycle there. So let's go ahead and loosen up this hose clamp and then the hose clamp that connects to your recycle over here. Now one more thing before we get started, I would avoid cutting any of this hose, and I would keep this with your heater just in case at any point in the future you want to return it to the stock, because this is not always a stock setup. Return it to the way it was before. It's nice to have these hoses ready and just plop that heater back in. The only time you would not want to keep these is if this is starting to get dry rotted or there's cuts in it, anything like that. Otherwise, hold on to these. They're good to have around. Now make sure too, while you take these off, that you retain these hose clamps. They're good to hold on to as well. Now it's not a huge deal if you get any water on your motor, unless it falls onto some of the electrics and shorts them out in some way. Although, if you think about it, water can pass through your grill and into this engine compartment pretty easily. But obviously you want to do your best to try and avoid making a huge mess, especially if it's mostly antifreeze. If it's not the summer, like right now, I have more water in my engine than I do coolant or antifreeze, but just something to keep in mind. There we go. So my favorite way to prevent any more coolant coming out of these lines while we're working on it is to actually put a screw right in the middle here, and you're going to want to make sure that the screw is big enough to, or small enough to where it can pass through the holes in your firewall, and then you just tighten this down like so. Just like that, easy peasy, you have a plugged hose that no longer is dumping any water out, which is great. Now another option you have is once you've disconnected both of these lines here, you can actually take a shop vac if you have a wet shop vac, and you can kind of put your hose nozzle, your suction hose, on this end and kind of tape it on there. It doesn't have to really be pretty, but turn that on, you can suck the majority of the coolant out of your heater, assuming that both of these holes are unplugged. If you have one plugged, it's not going to work because it'll just create a big old crazy amount of suction in there. But anyway, that's probably what I'm going to do. I've got a wet shop vac back here, so I'm going to attach that. I'll show you exactly how I do it, and then we can move on. All right, so that's kind of how I have it right there. Mostly airtight, nothing fancy. You want to make sure that you have it on the suck setting and not the blow setting, because that could be a very, very messy situation if it's on the blow setting. And we will go ahead and suck that out now. All right, so that should do it. I'll go ahead and show you the inside of the shop back here so you can kind of get an idea how much fluid is inside that thing. As you can see, there's not a ton. I imagine there's still a little bit trapped in the hose here, oh, you can't really see that. Yep, just a little bit of fluid there, just enough to fill a heater core. So now, put that back on. If you want to be extra super certain that that's all emptied out, you can attach the hose to the other side. It's a little bit shorter hose. It's a little bit closer to the heater itself. Let's get that showing a little bit better there. And might help you out a little bit, although I'm pretty confident that there is no more coolant inside that heater core. Also, did notice something while I was not recording. This screw that I was using to block that hole there like that is not going to fit through the hole where these hoses are coming through with the hose clamp on there. So that is going to have to remain open, or just take some tape and cover this real good on the end there if you want to be extra safe. So that pretty much covers the engine bay for right now. The next thing we're going to want to do is move into the car. I recommend working from the passenger side of the car because you're going to have a lot more room. And we'll start removing the heater core and the whole heater assembly. Cool, so part 2 of this whole job here. We are inside the car now, and the nice thing about these minis is they are dead simple in terms of how these heater cores work, how they fit in here, and how they're bolted up, honestly. If you look right back here, you won't be able to see too well in the video because it's in order to get all this in view, I couldn't really get close, but there's a nut on the back here. There's a nut on the back side on that side as well, and there's 2 screws on this side. And basically what you're going to do is just take out the 4 bolts and nuts that are holding this up here, and then this whole unit just comes down. It just sets down on the ground. As you can see, I've already disconnected the wires. Basically, you're just going to want to follow the wires to where they connect and disconnect those. If you have a cell phone with a camera or a smartphone, I strongly recommend taking a picture of those wires up in there if you can see them. That will help you if you ever decide to put this heater back in, which you might end up doing in the winter. You might decide, hey, this car is a little too cold, I want to be a little warmer. You can reference that photo later on to replug up these wires, because it can be a little confusing under there. There's quite a few wires running all over the place. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is take off the heater hoses. These run from your heater up the side and up to your defrost vents up here on the top. They're pretty easy to come off. They work like hose clamps. You just untighten those or loosen those nuts that are on here, and then it just comes right off. I'll show you. So nut number 1 is off. On my car, they are 7/16 bolts and nuts. So if you've got a Mark 1, Mark 2, you'll probably have the same size. If you have a newer car, it may have shifted. I'm actually not quite sure what size these are on newer cars. Make sure you hold on to these. We're going to put them back where they came off because the posts actually stay on your heater, and then you have your bolts on the front here, and those actually will come out. You can see right here underneath your speedometer. You just want to make sure you hold on to these. These are not something you want to lose. Those are loose. Now we're going to go ahead and take out the nuts and bolts. So once we loosen this last screw, that's going to be the last thing that's holding the heater up, so it's likely that this will fall down. If it does, just be ready to catch it. It might not fall all the way, but as you can see, mine's already pretty dang loose here, so I know mine's definitely going to come down. So there we have it. The heater is now loose, sitting on the ground here. Give it a shake. If you can't hear any liquid, it's probably empty if you sucked out all the liquid before. If you didn't, you don't want to disconnect these hoses, otherwise you're going to get coolant all over your carpet. That's not something you want. The next thing you want to do is just feed these hoses down from the engine side into the car and then pull them out. Now make sure that those hoses are covered, plugged, or just in one way or another, make sure that there is no coolant going to come out of those hoses. Alright, so the heater core is completely loose. So the next thing we're going to want to do is just lift this out of the car and set it to the side. And finally we're going to finish the coolant loop on the engine side of the car. So I'm going to bring it back out there and we'll finish up setting up the coolant so it runs all in the right places up there. Now, like I said before, all that's left is finishing the coolant loop on your engine. So to recap what I said earlier, if you have a coolant line that goes through your intake manifold, you're going to run your coolant from this spot right here on top of your head into the side of your intake manifold. There's a small hose opening there, and then it'll run out the other side over here and directly into this return pipe right there. If you don't have that, like my car, you're just going to run it directly from the top of the head into the return, which is over here. And that's all there is to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with some new hose that I purchased, and I'm going to reuse those hose clamps that I took off of these two places earlier. Great, so that's it. We are all finished. The only thing left you want to do is make sure that there are no coolant leaks after this job. Check all the points that we worked on. Just make sure there's nothing leaking there. If there are, just make sure that you address those. Otherwise, you are ready to roll. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments section below, and keep checking back for new videos every 2 weeks. Thanks.